It was a chilly Saturday morning when I first spotted it, an envelope stamped with the ominous HOA logo sitting smugly in my mailbox. Even before I touched it, I knew it spelled trouble. HOA letters never brought good tidings. They weren't about friendly reminders or cheerful holiday wishes. No, they delivered fines, warnings, and thinly veiled threats dressed up as official notices. My stomach churned as I plucked it out, the weight of impending doom settling in before I even tore it open. When I did, the contents were as absurd as they were maddening. A $200 fine for an unauthorized lawn ornament. I read it twice, half convinced I was seeing things. Unauthorized? It was just a single garden gnome, a small, harmless fellow with a cheeky grin and a fishing rod, a gift from my grandmother last Christmas. She'd said it would bring me luck. Apparently, all it had brought was an HOA citation. The letter dripped with that sanctimonious, overly formal tone HOA documents always carried, as if they were managing some elite institution rather than a suburban neighborhood committee drunk on its own power and lacking any shred of common sense. I glanced out at the gnome, perched proudly near my flower bed. He wasn't loud or garish, just a little ceramic guy, frozen mid-fish, exuding patience. My yard was pristine, grass trimmed, flowers neatly arranged. There was nothing sloppy or offensive about it. Yet, according to the HOA, my tiny fisherman was a blight on the community. As I mulled over this nonsense, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, confident, self-righteous heels clacking against the pavement. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Margaret, the HOA president, was on her way, clipboard in hand, her nose tilted just high enough to signal she fancied herself the neighborhood's reigning monarch. Margaret wasn't your average HOA busybody. She was the queen bee, wielding her self-appointed authority over every blade of grass and mailbox with glee. She had no life beyond enforcing rules, no personality beyond her obsession with community standards, and no purpose except ensuring nobody enjoyed themselves too much. She'd send emails over trash cans left out 5 minutes late and measure lawns with a ruler. She stopped in front of my house, arms crossed, a smug smirk playing on her lips. "You're in violation, Mr. Carter," she declared, as if I hadn't just read the letter myself. I took a deep breath, forcing a tight smile. "It's a garden gnome, Margaret." Her smirk widened. "It's an unauthorized lawn ornament. Decorations are strictly prohibited under Section 5, Article 3 of the HOA guidelines." I raised an eyebrow. "It's one gnome. How's that a problem?" Her eyes glinted with the thrill of petty tyranny. "Rules are rules," she said, tilting her head like she was lecturing a dim-witted kid. "You have 1 week to remove it, or the fine doubles." I stared at her, waiting for a crack in her facade, some hint she was kidding. But Margaret didn't kid. She lived for this, thrived on making others miserable. Seriously? A $200 fine for a tiny statue? She didn't flinch. "And if it's not gone in 7 days, it'll be $400. With that, she turned and strutted off, radiating the satisfaction only a petty dictator could muster. I stood there, letter in hand, glancing back at the gnome. He didn't look like a menace, just a little guy with a grin. At first, I considered removing him. Maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But as I thought about Margaret's endless stream of absurd citations over the years, something in me snapped. This wasn't just about the gnome. It was about principle. It was about her relentless quest to micromanage everyone's lives. A slow, mischievous grin spread across my face. If Margaret had an issue with one gnome, how would she handle 500? The idea hit me like lightning, so perfect I nearly laughed out loud. It was ridiculous, immature, and precisely the kind of petty revenge she had coming. I spent the afternoon plotting. I scoured the internet, garden stores, thrift shops, local listings. Gnomes were everywhere. Traditional ones with pointy hats, quirky ones dressed as Vikings or lounging in hot tubs, even glow-in-the-dark ones. The options were endless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my porch, beer in hand, eyeing my lone gnome like he was the commander of an army yet to come. "This is just the start," I murmured. He grinned back. Sleep barely came that night. My mind buzzed with plans. I wasn't just going to litter my yard with gnomes. I'd turn it into a gnome paradise, a spectacle so wild and absurd that Margaret wouldn't just be annoyed, she'd be mortified. I could already picture her reaction, eyes widening, face flushing, a scream of outrage when she realized she couldn't stop me. It was worth every penny I'd spent. Lying in bed, grinning at the ceiling, I made a silent vow to my ceramic buddy. By week's end, he'd have company. My yard would be a gnome empire. The next morning, I hit the ground running, on a mission to amass as many garden gnomes as possible. I started at the usual spots: hardware stores, garden centers, big box retailers, snagging every gnome I could find, regardless of size or style. Some held lanterns, others clutched fishing rods, a few pushed tiny wheelbarrows. They all came home with me. When the stores ran dry, I raided thrift shops and flea markets. That's where it got fun: faded gnomes with chipped paint, hatless ones, even handmade oddities that barely resembled gnomes. I didn't care. They were perfect. I haggled, bought in bulk, and even scored a guy's entire collection at a flea market for cheap. By day's end, my car was packed with ceramic figures, their painted eyes staring at me like they knew they were part of something big. But I wasn't finished. Online marketplaces became my next hunting ground. I placed bulk orders, bid on auctions, and arranged late-night pickups from strangers' porches, transactions that felt more like covert deals than decor shopping. One guy asked, "What are you doing with all these?" I grinned. "Starting a revolution." He nodded, handed me the box, and didn't press further. When the deliveries rolled in, my house overflowed. Gnomes covered my garage, crowded my living room, even spilled into the guest room. I stood amid the chaos, hands on hips, grinning. This was going to be epic. The night before the big reveal, I worked under cover of darkness, placing each gnome with care. Clusters stood guard by the flower beds. Others chatted in small groups. I hid a few in the bushes, their faces peeking out like spies. Lantern-holding gnomes lined the walkway to my door, while fishing ones gathered near the mailbox, as if they'd found a secret pond. Every inch of lawn was claimed. By sunrise, my yard was a gnome haven, hundreds of them, staring out with eternal cheer. It was surreal, absurd, and flawless. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, admiring my masterpiece as the neighborhood stirred. I didn't wait long for a reaction. At 7 a.m., a scream shattered the quiet, a loud, shrill wail of pure fury. I turned to see Margaret on the sidewalk, bathrobe flapping, clipboard trembling in her hand. Her face was a glorious shade of red as she took in the scene. She froze, mouth gaping, too stunned to speak. Her eyes darted from gnome to gnome, grappling with the scale of it. Then it hit her. This was deliberate, a direct jab at her fine, a declaration of war. What is this?" she finally sputtered, voice shrill. I sipped my coffee and stepped off the porch. "Morning, Margaret." "Something wrong." She pointed at my yard, hands shaking. This is a violation. An abomination. You can't do this." I raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I can. I checked the guidelines. There's no rule against multiple gnomes, just a vague bit about individual lawn ornaments. No limit specified." Her eyes bulged. I thought she might faint from rage. She clutched her clipboard tighter. "This is harassment. A mockery of community standards." I nodded. "Well, you know what they say. Rules are rules." She made a choked noise, half gasp, half growl. "This isn't over," she hissed, storming off, bathrobe billowing. I watched her go, barely stifling a laugh. Her reaction was better than I dreamed. By midday, my yard was the neighborhood's hot topic. Cars slowed to gawk. Neighbors snapped photos, laughing at the absurdity. A few clapped me on the back, dubbing it the ultimate HOA revolt. But the best moment came when my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, stepped onto her porch, surveyed my lawn, and placed a single gnome on her own grass with a sly smile. Within hours, others followed. By nightfall, gnomes dotted yards up and down the street. Margaret's nightmare was spreading. Less than a day later, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers hit every door, emails flooded inboxes, and she even knocked on doors to rally her troops. Her version painted me as a vandal ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity, as if I'd torched the place instead of adding statues. I went to the meeting for the show. Margaret paced up front like a war general, while the board sat stiffly behind a table. Neighbors filed in, whispering and smirking. This was the biggest drama in years. She launched into her tirade, slamming papers down. This is a disgrace. We have rules for a reason, standards, decorum, and some people, she glared at me, think they can mock them. She waved a photo of my yard like courtroom evidence. This is the chaos festering in our peaceful community. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. Another muttered, "It's just gnomes." Margaret's eyes twitched. "We cannot allow this. I propose an immediate ban on all gnome decorations, 72 hours to remove them, or fines." Murmurs rippled through the room. An older man, Mr. Ellis, raised his hand. "Margaret, is this really worth an emergency meeting? They're not hurting anyone." She bristled. "It's about principle. If we let one man clutter his yard with tacky junk, what's next? Flamingos? Santas in July?" I spoke up. "It ends with people enjoying their own homes without you policing every detail." She whirled on me. "You're violating standards." I smirked. "No, I'm not. Your rule bans an individual ornament, not multiples. I'm just creative." Laughter broke out. Margaret turned purple. Another neighbor, Mrs. Ortiz, piped up. "I think the gnomes are funny. My grandkids love them. We've got bigger problems than a themed yard." Margaret faltered, stunned by the pushback. Then a board member, Susan, spoke. "Even if we pass this, bylaws don't apply retroactively. Mr. Carter's gnomes would be grandfathered in." Silence. Then snickers. My grin widened. "So my gnomes stay?" Margaret's fists clenched. She was trapped by her own rules. She stormed out, muttering about fixing this. Her next move came fast. My trash bins vanished. Coincidence? Hardly. Then citations piled up. Grass too tall by a hair. A tiny driveway crack. A tilted mailbox. Petty nonsense. But neighbors noticed. They'd ignored her antics before, but post-Gnome, they fought back. Reports hit her own yard. Overgrown hedges, bins out late. My gnome army grew. Yards sprouted more bearded rebels. Margaret was losing it in them. She escalated, rearranging my gnomes one night into chaotic heaps. I pictured her sneaking around, flipping statues in a frenzy. Hilarious. I didn't get mad. I got even. I repositioned them, every single one facing her house. Next morning, she stepped out, froze, and retreated under their gaze. She called a city inspector, nothing illegal. Then the police, claiming intimidation via decorations. They laughed it off. She was unraveling, and everyone saw it. The rebellion swelled. Gnomes multiplied, poker-playing ones, yoga poses, a giant inflatable at the neighborhood entrance reading, "Welcome to Gnomeville." A petition to oust her gained steam. At the vote, the room cheered as she was removed as president. She sold her house and left, defeated. I placed a gnome on her step with a note. "May this bring you luck elsewhere." She drove off, silent. That night, we celebrated. Gnomes legal, neighborhood free. My petty revenge had sparked a revolution. The gnomes had won.